As the new lands in the West opened up, and on the kind of tail end of the Compromise of 1850 and that whole Fugitive Slave Act, became another issue, and it was over the railroad. At the same time, the opening of the Oregon and admission of California to the Union had convinced many Americans to go west. There was also several Americans who were getting the idea of creating a transcontinental railroad to connect the western territories to the East Coast. Now, this would be the beginning of spurring a huge economic boom in the United States with the building of transcontinental railroads that would eventually be interrupted periodically by the Civil War. But again, after the Civil War, they'd really pick up. In the 1850s, getting to the West Coast was a grueling task. Going on those overland trails, the California, the Oregon Trail, the Santa Fe Trail, and all of them, those wagon trains, I mean, they were dangerous. They took a long time. You could have Indian attacks, run out of food. There were just so many things that would be problematic, going with a wagon. But a transcontinental railroad would reduce the trip several days, and it would promote settlement and economic growth. So the Transcontinental Railroad to connect to those new Western territories appealed to a lot of people, especially businessmen and women, or businessmen at the time. But once again, we would see a conflict between Northern and Southerners over the rail line and where it should originate and go through. Of course, many Southerners preferred a southern route, beginning from New Orleans and going through the extreme southwestern territory. Secretary of War at the time, Jefferson Davis, who was a strong supporter of Southern interests, sent James Gadsden, who was a South Carolina politician and a railroad promoter, to buy land from Mexico. Because in order to go from New Orleans to the West Coast, there was still a small little bit of land in southern and present-day southern Arizona that still belonged to the Mexicans. So he sent James Gadsden to negotiate. The Mexican leader, Santa Anna, agreed to sell what was 30,000 square mile strip of land that's in that southern part of Arizona and New Mexico, which includes the city of what's now Tucson, and they agreed for a $10 million payment. So what would become the Gadsden Purchase officially completed the entire southwest of what's now the United States, as it bought that last little piece, as you can see on the map there in blue, of what's now southern Arizona and New Mexico. So this would obviously be beneficial for Southerners because it would boost Southern manufacturing, it would boost Southern exports of their cotton and just Southern commerce in general, because in the 1850s the Southern manufacturing and railroads and anything other than plantation agriculture mainly was lagging behind Northern manufacturing. However, in Congress, the head of the Senate Committee on Territories, Stephen A. Douglas, who was from Illinois, had his own idea for a transcontinental railroad. Now, since he was from Illinois, and he had his own personal interest, real estate interest in this as well, he wanted the eastern terminal of the new transcontinental railroad. He wanted it to start from Chicago. But unfortunately, he knew that any route that would begin from Chicago would go through territory that wasn't organized yet, that was west of Missouri and Iowa, that was basically now Kansas and Nebraska. So that territory would have to be settled. Uh-oh, we already know what's coming. So Douglas proposed a bill to organize a new territory and for it to be called Nebraska. Now the House of Representatives passed it fairly quickly, but Southerners who controlled the Senate's key committees, they refused to go along with it, and they prevented the bill from coming to a vote. So here we are, we're stalled. Southern senators made it clear to Douglas that if he wanted Nebraska organized, he needed to repeal the Missouri Compromise and allow slavery in the new territory. So if Stephen Douglas wants his railroad to start from Illinois and go through this new territory, and the Transcontinental Railroad, if the Transcontinental Railroad wasn't going to originate in the South through New Orleans, then the people in the South wanted to be guaranteed that this new territory would at least allow slavery. So Stephen Douglas knew that any attempt to repeal the Missouri Compromise would divide the country. So he was kind of hesitant to do that. But nevertheless, he wanted to open the northern Great Plains to settlement, and he wanted his railroad. Douglas believed that if he kind of skillfully maneuvered his bill through Congress, he could kind of split the Whig Party and quiet the slavery issue. But unfortunately, Douglas had badly misjudged the depth of anti-slavery feelings in the North. So again, he tried to dodge the slavery issue at first in the Nebraska Territory. Um, so what he instead decided to do was say, okay, well, this new Nebraska Territory is going to have popular sovereignty. We'll just let the people there decide. But Southerners didn't jump for that. They weren't fooled. They knew if the Missouri Compromise remained in place while the region was settled, that slaveholders wouldn't be able to go there, because he could claim popular sovereignty would be allowed there all he wants to try to dodge the slave question. But Southerners knew, hey, that's above the Missouri Compromise line. You may say that there will be a popular sovereignty there, but just as soon as you start building your railroad and we start going up there, then the people will be claiming that slavery is not allowed there because it's above the Missouri Compromise line. So Stephen Douglas, who was determined to get the territory organized and have his transcontinental railroad begin in Illinois, he took the fateful step in creating a bill that would undo the Missouri Compromise and allow slavery in the region. He also proposed dividing the region into two territories. Nebraska would be the northern territory, and to the south of it would be Kansas. And again, this bill outraged Northerners and Whigs and Free Soilers. They called it a slave power plot. Undoing the Missouri Compromise to them, the Missouri Compromise was just sacred to a lot of people back then. I mean, it was what balanced slave and free states. It was just like the Northwest Territories, Northwest Ordinance. But nonetheless, despite the opposition, the leaders of the Democrats in Congress won enough support to pass the Kansas-Nebraska Act. There was enough Democrats in the Senate to barely get this Kansas-Nebraska Act passed in 1854. And oh boy, so we had this new Kansas and Nebraska territory, but popular sovereignty is extended there, and we're about to see what entails popular sovereignty. There's really no way to determine how slavery is going to be decided in these new territories. Are they going to vote for it, or are they going to fight for it? Well, we'll see that in the Kansas territory. There's going to be a fight. Now, Nebraska, of course, it being so far north, they kind of knew it was going to be mostly free soilers and people against slavery. But Kansas was going to be a different story. Now, on this slide, you'll see a better illustration of the point. Now, you'll see from Illinois, from Chicago right there, that red line goes right through that Kansas and Nebraska territory that wasn't settled just yet. And that's the Kansas and Nebraska territory that this new bill created. Nobody really doubted whether or not Nebraska would come in, but it was Kansas where the fight would be, because you see it kind of goes right up next to Missouri. It's right across from Arkansas. There's going to be a lot of so-called border ruffians that are going to move into Kansas and try to, determine to make that a slave state. So that's that Kansas-Nebraska territory, and it's fixing to be an awfully big fight over the Kansas territory, whether or not it's going to be a slave or a free territory. And again, it's going to be a small-scale indicator of what's to come for the rest of the country. They literally called it Bleeding Kansas because of all the conflict and the armed battles that took place over, between the pro-slavery and anti-slavery people there. Kansas became the first true battleground between those favoring the extension of slavery and those opposing it. Since eastern Kansas offered the same climate and rich soil as the state of Missouri, people from Missouri were more likely to bring their slaves over there to cultivate new area for crops. But northern settlers, especially being with the support of what was called the New England Immigrant Aid Society, an abolitionist group that recruited settlers and helped pay for them to go and settle Kansas in order to make it a free state. This faction of people obviously wanted to, bring Kansas into the Union as a free state. But pro-slavery Senator David Atchison of Missouri responded by calling on men from his state to storm into Kansas. In the spring of 1855, thousands of armed Missourians, called border ruffians in the press, voted illegally, which helped create a pro-slavery legislature in the new Kansas territory. The absolutely furious anti-slavery settlers countered by holding a convention in Topeka and drafting their own constitution that excluded slavery. So in 1856, Kansas literally had two governments. So on the 21st of May of 1856, these border ruffians, the pro-slavery group, um, who got angered by the arrival of more Northerners. And there's no doubt that at this point there's certainly more anti-slavery people in Kansas. So the Border Ruffians are going to literally resort to armed attacks to intimidate, free soilers in Kansas. So they attacked the town of Lawrence, Kansas, which was a town of a lot of anti-slavery settlers. They wrecked newspapers, burned homes, killed people. It was just a terrible situation. Bleeding Kansas, as they called it. Newspapers were calling it. By the end of 1856, over 200 people had been killed in this conflict, and over $2 million worth of property had been destroyed. So Kansas is already kind of giving us a microcosm of what is going to happen in the rest of the United States later. This is really the first. It's a mini civil war between pro-slavery and anti-slavery people. Well, while the bullets flew and the blood ran in Kansas over the free soilers and the border ruffians over the future of slavery there, to kind of just add insult to injury, or just kind of a short reflection of how divided we were at the time, in May of 1856, Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, who was a fierce abolitionist, delivered a speech when he was just really personally lamenting and accusing pro-slavery senators of forcing Kansas into the ranks of slave states. But he especially singled out Senator Andrew Butler of South Carolina, claiming that he had chosen a mistress in slavery. Just really attacked him personally, and slave owners and slave promoters in general. So several days later, on the 22nd of May, Butler's second cousin, Representative Preston Brooks, he walked up to Charles Sumner in the Senate chamber while he was sitting at his desk, and Brooks just attacked him and shouted that Sumner's speech was a libel on South Carolina and his relative, that he had dishonored them. And before Sumner could even stand up from his desk and reply to Preston Brooks, he pulled out a gold-handled hickory cane and beat him savagely with it. Literally. It left Charles Sumner severely injured, and just left him bleeding on the floor. It really knocked him out of commission for quite a while. He would really never be the same. Beat him until the hickory cane, just started to break with its golden handles. Now this was just absurd to see a senator literally attacked, caned at his own desk. Now this just depicts a country that's dividing fast. A lot of Southerners hailed Brooks as a hero. Some Southerners even sent him canes with the phrase "hit him again" inscribed on it. Shocked by the attack and outraged by the flood of Southern support for Brooks, Northerners strengthened their determination to resist slavery. One New York man confided in his journal that no way is left for the North but to strike back or be slaves. This is just, we're reaching a point of no return, and it's only going to get worse.